In 1452, a man walked into the city of Constantinople and offered to sell the emperor a weapon. It was the largest cannon ever built, a bronze monster 27 feet long, capable of firing a stone ball half a ton in weight. The emperor listened, and then he sent the man away. He couldn't afford it. A year later, that same cannon was hauled across the plains of Thrace, dragged into position outside the walls of Constantinople, and pointed at the city that had refused to buy it. What happened next ended the Roman Empire. For 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the capital of the Roman Empire. Not the Rome of senators and colosseums. That empire had collapsed in the West 1,000 years earlier. This was the eastern half, the half that survived. And it had walls that no army had ever broken through. The city had been besieged 23 times. 23 times the walls held. By 1452, the empire was a ghost of itself. The territories were gone. What remained was Constantinople itself and a few scraps of land. An empire reduced to a single city. The treasury was empty. The emperor, Constantine XI, couldn't pay his own soldiers. The Roman Empire still called itself Roman. It still wore purple. It still crowned its emperors in the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. But it was dying, and everyone knew it, especially the boy across the water. His name was Mehmed II. He was 21 years old, and he had spent every day of his short reign planning to do what no one had managed in 1,000 years: take Constantinople. The European powers were sure he was too young, too inexperienced. Even his own court underestimated him. Mehmed had read everything: Roman history, Greek philosophy, the accounts of every previous siege, 23 of them, and exactly why each one had failed. He knew the walls couldn't be climbed. He knew the harbor couldn't be entered. The defenders had stretched a massive iron chain across its mouth that no fleet could break. He knew that for 1,000 years, every army that had stood where his army would stand had eventually gone home. Mehmed had no intention of going home. But willpower wouldn't break the walls. He needed something that had never existed before. His name was Orban. He was Hungarian, a foundryman. In 1452, he arrived in Constantinople and offered his services to Emperor Constantine. He had a design, he said, for a cannon unlike anything that had ever existed. A weapon so powerful that no wall on earth could withstand it. Constantine listened. He offered Orban a job, but the salary he could afford was a fraction of what Orban had asked for. The empire was simply too poor. Orban left. He went straight to the Ottoman court. He told Mehmed exactly what he had told Constantine. Mehmed asked one question: how soon? Then he gave Orban 4 times the salary Constantine had offered. Unlimited materials, anything he needed. 3 months later, the cannon was cast. When it was test-fired, the report could be heard 10 miles away. The cannon was so heavy it had to be pulled by 60 oxen, with 200 men walking alongside to keep it stable. Roads were widened. Bridges were reinforced. By the time it arrived outside the walls of Constantinople in early April 1453, the city was already surrounded. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, a fleet blockading the seas. And now, the weapon designed to end the walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Inside the city, Constantine had 7,000 defenders. The siege began on April 6th. For 53 days, nearly 70 cannons bombarded the walls of Constantinople without pause. The walls had been built to withstand catapults and battering rams, built before gunpowder existed. Against Orban's cannon, they began to crack. Each impact sent a half-ton stone ball into walls that had stood since the 5th century. Then, Mehmed did something no one thought possible. His fleet was anchored in the Bosphorus, the strait we today call the Strait of Istanbul, separating Europe from Asia. To reach the harbor, they would have to break through the Great Iron Chain, so Mehmed didn't try. He had his ships hauled over land. Greased logs were laid across the hills behind the city. 70 ships were dragged across them in a single night into the harbor, bypassing the Great Iron Chain entirely. By dawn, the defenders woke up to find their harbor, the one approach they thought was safe, full of enemy warships. Inside the city, food ran out. Soldiers fought in shifts because there weren't enough of them to hold the walls. Constantine refused to leave. Mehmed sent a final message: surrender and live. Resist, and Constantinople would fall, and so would everyone in it. Constantine answered him with silence. The final assault came at 1 a.m. on May 29, 1453. Mehmed sent his irregulars in first, untrained, expendable, used to absorb the defenders' arrows and exhaust their ammunition. Thousands died in the first hour. Then the regular Ottoman troops. The defenders held them off, barely. Then came the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite guard, trained from childhood, the most disciplined soldiers in the world. And in the same hour, the cannon punched through. A section of the wall finally collapsed. The breach was wide enough for men to pour through. The fighting became hand-to-hand in the rubble of a wall that had stood for 1,000 years. Constantine saw it happening. He understood what was coming. He took off his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the eagle-emblazoned armor that marked him as Emperor of Rome. He drew his sword. He charged into the breach, fighting alongside common soldiers, men who didn't know who he was, men who would never know. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Rome, the heir of Augustus, the wearer of the purple, died fighting in the rubble, anonymous in the dark. His body was never found. By dawn, the Ottoman flag flew over the walls. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Constantinople was not Roman. Mehmed entered the city later that morning. He was 21 years old. He had just done what no one had managed in 1,000 years. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, for 900 years the greatest church in the world. He walked through it in silence. He looked up at the dome. Then he ordered it converted into a mosque. Outside, the sack began. The remaining 30,000 were killed, enslaved, or scattered. The libraries were ransacked. Manuscripts that had survived 1,000 years, the only copies of Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, destroyed or sold to merchants who didn't know what they had. The fall of Constantinople accelerated the movement of Greek scholars and ancient manuscripts into Western Europe, and in dying, it handed Europe its own past. Empires don't fall when you expect them to. They fall when something they thought was permanent, a wall, a treaty, a technology, meets something they didn't see coming. For 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople were the most permanent thing in the medieval world. They had outlasted plague, schism, crusade, and conquest. Nothing could break them. And then, a Hungarian foundryman walked into the imperial court and named a price the empire couldn't pay. Constantine couldn't afford him. Mehmed could. Constantinople fell because it could not afford to keep being Constantinople.